Hi, I'm Rob B with Rob D, and the Property Podcast is 7 years old.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning for 7 years, property investors have come to be informed and inspired. And I know that some of you have been with us ever since the very beginning. Yeah, you probably got the same feeling as us when you realise that we've been doing it for 7 years now and wondering where your life has gone. But whether you've been with us from the beginning or you've joined us more recently, we're going to be looking back at what's changed in the property market over the last 7 years and where you would be today if you'd taken action 7 years ago.
So, Rob, time for our news story. It's probably one of the most important news stories I've seen in the press for a long time. The headline reads, one of the UK's top property podcasts set to go live at an event. What's happening?
How did this get in here? That's embarrassing. Yeah, this is a Property Investor Today reporting on Property Hub Live. Very cool that they've picked it up. They're reporting on the event that we're holding on the 30th of April in London. Don't feel left out, everyone else. We're doing one in Manchester later in the year as well. And as they correctly report, it's going to be a packed day of property education with nothing for sale, just good, solid info. We're going to be attempting to record the Property Podcast live as well. And in the evening, it's going to be followed by our biggest Hubber meetup ever. So it's going to be pretty awesome. We're recording this podcast a little bit in advance, but it's possible, Rob, that there will still be some tickets left.
Yeah, there's a small chance, so it's worth heading over to the link just in case. And you can find that on our events page. So that's propertyhub.net/events. If it has sold out, there'll be some sort of backup waiting list so you can put your name down there as well. Obviously, no promises, and it is an outside chance if you put your name down. But if you're desperate to go and you have missed out, worth doing at the very least. But it's going to be an incredible day. We're really, really looking forward to doing it. And most importantly, because we'll be sharing it with hundreds of you. It's going to be ace.
So today we are looking back over 7 years of the Property Podcast. Believe it or not, we started all the way back in early 2013. And that feels like a really long time ago, because it was. If you remember all the way back then, the UK's AAA credit rating had just been downgraded. That was the big story at the time. Everyone was still pretty worried about the economy post-recession at that point. Thrift Shop by Macklemore and Ryan Lewis was topping the charts, and Les Miserables was number one at the box office. If you remember any of those things, they probably feel like a while ago, because a lot has happened since then, including in property. So we're going to look back at some of those major changes, including property prices, interest rates, legislation, and a lot more. And this isn't just a self-indulgent walk down memory lane, because a few weeks ago, we talked about how to invest over the next 7 years. Well, now we can look with perfect hindsight at the last 7 years, and you can see where you'd be today if you'd done certain things right back when the Property Podcast started. So there's going to be a lot to learn and to take away and apply to your property investing from this day forwards. So, Rob, a lot has changed, but let's start with the one thing that's barely changed over the 7 years of the podcast, and that's the interest rate.
This is amazing. Like, when you give it a bit of thought, of course this is the case. But when we kind of put the show notes for this together, it was like, wow, I can't believe it. And what I can't believe is that when we started the podcast, interest rates were 0.5%. I know they have been low for ages, but it's just crazy how much time flies and goes by and how used we are now to low interest rates. I mean, Rob, it wasn't even the week before the podcast that it dropped to 0.5. They've been at that level for a few years.
Yeah, it's really mad to think that there are going to be people in their early 30s who don't remember interest rates being any other way. It's really crazy. It's also crazy when you look to the big swings that we've had historically, how much conversation there is now around absolutely tiny moves. So it was 0.5% for ages, then it got cut to 0.25%, which was seen as really big news. And now finally it's gone all the way up to 0.75%. So minor variations, but it's really just different flavours of very, very low.
So what's always interesting is to go back and look at property prices. And back when we started the podcast, the average UK property was £163,000. In today's money, you've got to account for inflation, that's £191,000, or £191,902 to be exact. Now, today, the price of an average property in the UK is £215,925. So that's an increase of 32.5%. So it's beaten inflation. It's a healthy return in 7 years. Of course, it's not doubling, But remember, as wherever we've been over the last 7 years economically, it's not been the best of times. And to still have that sort of growth is amazing, it's fantastic. But Rob, of course, that's an average. And there really isn't such a thing as an average UK property. I don't know where that place is or where it exists, but it's actually made up of lots of different places and lots of different areas. So you've dug into the data and broken down some of the key cities and the changes there.
Yeah, because there's been a lot of variation, and I've picked out a few of the places that we've probably talked about the most on the podcast over the last 7 years. So Manchester would top the list of places we've talked about by quite a fair margin. When we started the podcast, the average property in Manchester would have cost you 120,000. Now it's 173,000. So that's a 44% increase compared to the 32.5 for the UK as a whole. Liverpool was 98,000, now 122,000. So that's only a 24% increase, so actually less than the UK average, which is really interesting when you pair it with all the activity that's going on there at the moment, because it further suggests how much upside there is still to come. You obviously wouldn't say that if there was nothing going on in an area, but as we talked about when we were talking about our hotspots at the start of the year, so much going on in Liverpool itself, plus the ripple effect from Manchester. You look at all that next to the fact that it's had below average growth over the last 7 years, which actually really surprised me when I found that out, and think, wow, there's so much more potential here.
Yeah, and that's why, if you listen back to the podcast 7, 6, 5 years, 4 years ago, 3 years ago even, we weren't really talking about Liverpool. It's only recently. And that's because while it's great today, doesn't mean that a place or a city is the best place to invest throughout an entire cycle. You look at London, fantastic growth. It was 305,000 when we started the podcast, and now it's 479,000. So a huge increase of 57%, the highest that we've featured here. However, if you based it on the last few years, it'd be the lowest of the three. So there's two things to take away from this. If you're looking at shorter term growth or returns, then timing is everything. However, over the longer term, you will be rewarded. All of those places have done well, over the last 7 years, between 24 and 57% returns, really good returns. But if you bought in the right places at the right times, then those returns are really exaggerated. Now, if you were listening to us on the podcast early on, we did call London too early, as in called the end of the London boom too early, probably about 2 years too early. So if you did follow our advice back then I apologise. We got that wrong. We got it right eventually, but I suppose if you say something for long enough, you'll eventually be right. That's something early on that we got wrong. We've been given a lot of praise for getting things right about Manchester and pulled that market right, but we also, need to be transparent and say we got that wrong with London. That's possibly the biggest mistake in the podcast we've made over the last 7 years.
Yeah, let's be honest. Early and wrong are the same thing, really, aren't they, when it comes to actually taking action on it? The reasoning was sound. It just took longer than we thought it would. And we've tried to take that into account in more recent years, learn from that, which is possibly, we've been a little bit more accurate. So prices up in the UK as a whole and in lots of the key cities. You therefore would expect affordability to have got worse. And that is indeed the case, but not by as much as you'd think. So first-time buyer affordability has gone up from 4.4 to 5, which is the multiple of house price to earnings for first-time buyers, which is an increase, but not a big one. And it's actually been improving for the last 2 years. And again, that's the average, but there are regional variations. So in the north and in Yorkshire, affordability is actually completely unchanged over the last 7 years. Affordability's only got slightly worse in the northwest, massively skewed, as you might expect from London and the southeast, which are far less affordable than they were 7 years ago for first-time buyers. An important component of affordability, though, Rob, for owner-occupiers and for investors is mortgages. And that's an area where there's been some really interesting changes over the last 7 years.
So, yeah, if you look at residential mortgages, because there's more data on that, if you look at the average 2-year fix back in March 2014, the rate that you were paying, the average rate that you were paying was 2.37%. So pretty good, as you'd expect. Interest rates were low. They were 0.5%. So today, at 0.75%, it's another 0.25 up, right? Well, no. Actually, it's gone the other way, and by quite a bit. The average rate now for a 2-year fixed residential is 1.5%. So it's almost dropped a full percent, even though interest rates have gone up. Now, that may sound crazy to a lot of you, but this is something we talked about on the podcast early on, that when the mortgage market gets more competitive, even as interest rates start to tick up, the lenders will accept less of a margin because they don't want to lose out as the market increases. So even if interest rates in the future continue to go up, don't expect interest rates to shoot up exactly the same alongside them. The margins that these banks are willing to accept will possibly come down further. So at the moment, the interest rates are 0.75 and you lend out 1.45, but that margin between those two numbers could come down further in the future. So if you're hearing this for the first time, you may be surprised. But if you listen to the podcast for a long time, hopefully you won't be, because this is something that we said would happen. It's happened in previous cycles. This isn't us being really clever. It's just looking at past patterns and then playing out again. But it's one thing saying it and another thing seeing it, and it's fascinating to see it play out again in another property cycle.
So house prices have gone up. Rents have gone up as well, pretty much in line with inflation, which we haven't mentioned, but they have. And mortgages have got cheaper. Pretty great times for property investors all round, right? Well, actually, maybe not so much, because there's been a lot of change on the legislation side over the last 7 years as well. We don't need to labour them too much, because you should by now be aware of this. But it was a real shock in 2015 when the huge change around mortgage interest was brought in, as well as the surcharge of stamp duty of 3% for investors. Those changes really shook things up and had a real impact on sentiment around property, which we'll talk about in a bit. There was also a trend, unsurprisingly, for more and more regulation of the property sector. So we've seen minimum energy standards be introduced. We've seen the right to rent scheme. We've seen licensing schemes locally pop up and start to spread across the country. We've seen tenant fees banned and a whole lot more. That's just the highlights. And that's not looking like it's going to stop. So the removal of the Section 21 eviction process seems like the next big change on the horizon. So, Rob, if you take all of this together, one of the things that we've seen since we started the podcast is this clear trend of professionalization. If it ever was, with every passing year, property investing is becoming less and less something you can just fall into and blag your way through.
Absolutely. That's been possibly the biggest change over the last 7 years. And while it may have been a difficult pill for many investors and landlords to swallow, it was needed. It was far too loose. And now I'm not saying everything that's been done is correct and right and agree with each point, but the overall sentiment of trying to make property investment more professional is a good thing. You are dealing with people's homes. People live in these places. And while I'm sure the vast majority, if not all, property podcast listeners have good intentions and want to provide good homes, unfortunately, not everybody would. And it's not necessarily because people were evil, it's just that they didn't take the responsibility seriously of providing homes for other people. So by making this sector more professional, it has meant that people now have to educate themselves to become a property investor, and you can do that for free. We put a fair bit of content out to help you do that. But I think that's a good thing. It stops people going into it lightly, or certainly it's going to stop a lot of people going into it lightly. And that means that the sector as a whole performs better, and the end user, the people who rent these properties, have a better experience. So yes, while those changes happened and we're caught up in the emotion of it all, I was like probably nearly everyone else, like, oh my God, what's happening? But actually now, after time's passed and reflecting back, on the whole, the direction that the property market's moving in is a better one. And Rob, reflecting is a big part of this type of podcast that we're doing now, going back over a 7-year period. And it's amazing how the sentiment of the market has changed so much during the 7 years. You wouldn't think that the whole mood around property would change so much in such a relatively small period. 7 years, well, yes, it's a lot of podcasts, and yes, a lot can happen. But vast mood swings and sentiment changes around how people have felt about property during that time period is actually quite incredible.
Yeah, for me, this is the most interesting part of reflecting and thinking back and digging out some of the data to put this episode together. And it might be tempting to think of this as kind of the fluffy stuff on top and just how you feel about things. But actually, as we know, so much of the economy in general comes down to sentiment and how you feel. Every indicator could be saying one thing, but if people feel the other way, that's going to have an effect on the market. And we've been through some massive swings in sentiment over the last 7 years. When we started, we were trying to talk property up. Everyone was feeling negative about property at the time. As I mentioned back at the start, the UK had just lost its AAA credit rating. People were not feeling good about the economy, even though we were nearly 5 years on from the crash of 2008. prices in most of the UK took a long time to recover. The economic recovery was slow. The recovery in property prices was slow. Prices in most areas were flat for pretty much 3 years after the crash had taken place. Even though we were nearly 5 years on from the crash of 2008, prices jumped back a little bit through 2009, but after that they were flat for pretty much 3 years. So of course, professional property investors were still doing their thing, but good luck getting anyone in the general public interested in the idea of investing in property. We were trying, but I remember going to viewings around that time. Estate agents absolutely bending over backwards to accommodate you and try to make sales happen because there just weren't buyers in the market back then. So that was the reality when we started the podcast. But the amazing thing, Rob, is how quickly that changed.
Yeah, absolutely. In just 2 years, by 2015, things had really got quite frothy. People were talking property up. And that was driven by, London and London really pushing on, and the newspapers and the media were really talking up property. There was a lot more press attention. So what were we doing? Well, we were actually talking people back down. We were trying to say to people, calm down a bit. It's not throw a bit of money in and get a lot of money out. But what's fascinating is that didn't last long. And in a short space of time, things changed again.
Yeah, largely because of the tax changes, which were really a government response to everyone getting so carried away. I think they probably had an exaggerated sense of that property prices were getting out of control because they were looking at the southeast, and in much of the country that wasn't the case. But nevertheless, there was this real political will to do something about high house prices and runaway investment. So we had all the changes that were announced around mortgage interest and around stamp duty, which almost overnight punctured the bubble. All those headlines about how great buy-to-let is and how to get into it overnight turned into how buy-to-let was over and it was a terrible investment and everyone was going to be ruined. Then in 2016, we had the EU referendum, which sparked a lot of uncertainty and debate, which to some extent is still going on now. As a result of that, we had to switch again and start talking the market back up again and explaining how property still is a great investment for the long term. There were certainly new challenges and maybe the short-term rewards weren't quite the same, but none of this really matters if you zoom out far enough. But Rob, if there's a single concept that's probably the thing that most people will associate with the property podcast, not that it was ours, we totally nicked it, but something we've talked about endlessly is the property cycle. And when you look at everything we've just talked about through the prism of the property cycle, it's not that surprising. It's kind of what the cycle would have predicted.
Yes, Rob, absolutely. It lines up with the property cycle, the 18-year property cycle that we talk about so often. While it all felt dramatic and quite intense during those time periods, later on, as you look back, it's like, well, of course, yeah, this is always going to play out. And we were able to make a lot of our predictions off the back of it. And yes, we got some wrong, but we got a lot right. And it's not because we were the geniuses. We didn't put the 18-year property cycle together. We just studied it, followed it, looked at past trends and gone, well, actually, this makes a lot of sense, and just talked about it and shared that knowledge with you. But what's really interesting when you look at the change in sentiment over time, there's famous quotes out there, I'll paraphrase, but Warren Buffett talks about when others are fearful, be greedy, and when others are greedy, be fearful. But that really does ring true. When everybody was doing something else, what we've echoed through the years on the podcast, when people are being really scared about the market and what's happening, we've really pushed property investment and made people aware of it as much as we can. And so I think it needed championing. But then when everybody was starting to get excited, that's when we kind of withdrew and said, no, actually, you need to calm down.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning, though, that saying it is one thing, but doing it is quite another. And to be fair to us, we have practiced what we've preached, but looking at it with hindsight now, it's all so much easier. I wish I knew then what I knew now. I would have taken advantage of the poor sentiment around property in the early days so much more. And I would have done things a bit differently as well. Even in 2015, when we were a couple of years into the podcast, at that point, I was largely following a buy, refurbish, refinance strategy on cheap properties. And in some cases, pulling all my deposit back out, which seems brilliant. But in retrospect, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, it cost me a fortune because I should have recognised at that point that prime property was on sale and really loaded up on that. So I think even when you recognise what's going on, having the bravery to go against the crowd is not easy.
Yeah, and I made a mistake in a different way, Rob. I was trying to be too clever that ended up being silly because I was trying to go ahead of the market and really push into areas that were far too early. And again, missed out on getting into prime earlier. So missed the same opportunity, but done for different reasons. However, as we've heard, though, over the long term, It doesn't really matter. For either of us, what we did wasn't a disaster. It's got us where we are today. So we're not moaning, far from it. It's just that when you do look back over a 7-year period, you go, if I'd just done this or that differently, then I'd be in a better position. But that doesn't serve you and that doesn't help you to look at things that way. If you're listening to this and you have invested over the last 7 years, don't be going, I should have done that differently. Just be pleased that you have invested. Because let's look at average. If you'd taken a UK property, an average UK property, for 163,000 when the podcast started, so that was the average price back then, and you put down a £45,000 deposit, your equity today would now be 92,750 because you've leveraged. So that's 100% ROI, 45 up to 92, before any rental income. So just on the market moving up, and just because you've leveraged, you're on a 100% return in an average investment. In what has really, Rob, if you think about it, been an average 7 years for property. It's been okay, but it's not been spectacular.
Yeah, you could have had a spectacular time over the last 7 years. You could have made above average purchases. You could have bought at discounts. You could have bought in hotspots. You could have done really clever things to force up the value of properties. But even if you didn't do any of that, making 100% return in a really average 7 years really shows the power of property, I think. We've talked about the phases that we've been through over the last 7 years, and there were a couple of years of excitement in there. But I don't think anyone would argue that it's been a vintage period for property investors. It's not been great. It's not been terrible, even though there's been lots going on politically that's got everyone very excited. And it's felt like there's been a lot going on all the time. If you look at property prices, not that much has really happened. But you know what? I would take these 7 years any day, because if it stayed like that forever, if you could make that kind of return just by being average, and you could do far better than that by being a bit smart, and you could just do that forever without any drama, that would be amazing. But if the property cycle teaches us anything, it tells us there's no way that's going to happen. Even though the long-term trend is up, it's not going to happen in a nice straight line. There's going to be booms and there's going to be crashes. Over the next 7 years, Rob, it seems highly unlikely to me that we'll just see prices ticking on at a couple of % a year again.
No, and this is the crazy thing, is that hopefully by us looking back at the last 7 years, you can see that we've learned a lot, and hopefully during the process of this podcast, you've learned a lot. If we look at the next 7 years and what we expect because of the cycle, the next 7 years are not going to be average. They're going to be quite aggressive in terms of cycle terms. There's a lot that's going to happen. And when I say a lot, I mean positive growth, more positive than we've seen in the previous 7 years. So again, if you're just being average during the next 7 years, but you're being active, then you'll do really well. That's the thing about this. It's taking action. It's participating in these cycles that helps. You can consume the podcast, but until you take the action, you're not going to get those returns. Average for some people may not be that attractive, but for your financial health, if you invest in property, it's brilliant. So use this knowledge, use the reflections we've given you, and then take action, because that's what's going to make the difference to your next 7 years.
If you take action, then before long, hopefully, you'll be sending us a success story, because we love to hear them. And we make it really easy for you to send them in. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at Property Hub UK, or you can send us an email, you can post on the forum, or you can leave us a lovely podcast review. This week's success story comes from Nigel, and he actually left this on Facebook in response to the Rich Dad Poor Dad video that we posted recently. So do head over to YouTube and check that video out if you haven't already, because it's a good one. And Nigel says of the book, "This book is dynamite, along with the schooling we've had from the Property Hub guys. We started investing through our SPV in September, and we are on our 4th buy-to-let already. Thanks, guys. You have changed our lives." Well, that's very high praise, Nigel, which is thoroughly undeserved, because you have changed your own life by taking action, like Rob said.
So it's time for Hub Extra, the part of the show where we just want to give you a bit more before we finish. And Rob's got a book recommendation for you. We love a good book. So Rob, what have you been reading?
Yeah, I've just finished a book, which it turns out, Rob, you've recommended on the podcast before, but I discovered it through other means and completely forgotten that you'd recommended. So I very nearly didn't give you the credit for this, but you deserve it. Or rather, the author deserves most of the credit because it's a really good book. It's called Bitcoin Billionaires. And if you remember the film The Social Network, which was about the origin story of Facebook, you'll remember the Winklevoss twins, who kind of came off as the bad guys in that film. But this book talks about everything that they've done since, which is, in short, make a heck of a lot of money through Bitcoin. It kind of uses them as a means of exploring what's happened in Bitcoin in general. And it's a really amazing story with lots of fascinating characters. And it's a really easy and entertaining read. So if you haven't already acted on Rob's recommendation and checked that one out, I thoroughly encourage you to do so.
So that's us done for another week. Let us know what you thought of the podcast. Loads of ways to get in touch through the Property Hub forum. You can let us know through our social platforms, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube. You can find us at Property Hub UK. As you're waiting for your next podcast, which will be out on Tuesday with Ask Rob and Rob, you can go and check out all those lovely social things going on there. And of course, we'll be back next Thursday with the Property Podcast. So until then, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.